The wind moved like an old whisper through the trees that lined the edge of Boone's Ridge, dry branches clacking like bones warning of something just out of sight. It was the kind of afternoon where even the birds quieted, watching the road, with uneasy eyes. That's when the wagon appeared, not in triumph, not in peace, but in silence. 2 women rode in the back, heads lowered, bonnets casting long shadows over bruised cheeks and sealed mouths. Clara May sat upright, though her bones begged her to fold. Her hands clutched a worn satchel, knuckles pale and fingers cracked. She didn't dare blink too long. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shovel flung aside by Ezekiel after he threw the last clump of earth onto her husband's grave. That same hand, thick and veined like twisted oak, had pulled her up by the arm just this morning and told her she was no longer welcome in the house her husband built. Too much trouble, he'd spat. You and your cursed tongue. Maybe the woods'll make something useful of you. Beside her, Liza June didn't flinch when the wagon jostled over a rut. Her older sister-in-law had stopped flinching years ago. She just stared at the horizon like she was watching her own funeral. The back of her neck was red from sun and shame. Neither woman had spoken since the wagon rolled out from the Caldwell homestead. Ezekiel at the reins, Burrow riding flank on horseback, chewing tobacco like it was justice. They weren't being taken anywhere. They were being left. The thickened. The road thinned. The men grew quieter. That was the moment Clara May understood just how far gone they were. The wagon creaked to a halt at a break in the trees where no trails led forward. The air smelled of moss and sour pine sap. Burrow slid off his horse with a grunt, spit into the weeds, and yanked Liza June by the arm. She didn't resist. Ezekiel nodded toward the trees. You'll find a creek 2 miles in. There's rabbits, maybe some berries. That's more than you deserve. And when the wolves come, Clara May's voice was low, unused, barely more than breath. Ezekiel stepped toward her like he might strike, but he didn't. He just looked her over with disgust, like a dog too skinny to eat. They'll leave you be once they see there's nothing worth biting. The world was still 4, a long beat. The wagon wheel clicked as it settled. Somewhere in the brush, a crow called once, and then, from between the trees, came the sound of a boot snapping a branch. Ezekiel turned, hand already on his belt knife. Burrow squinted into the shadows. Clara May saw him first. A man emerged from the woods, tall and deliberate, carrying a bundle of traps and a long rifle slung low across his back. His shirt was sun-bleached. Dust clung to his boots, and his eyes were the kind that didn't move fast, but saw everything. He didn't speak. Ezekiel stepped forward, puffed up like a rooster. Ain't none of your concern, stranger, just family business. Still, the man didn't speak. He just looked from the women to the men. Then finally, he turned toward Clara May, and met her gaze like he'd known her once in a dream. Clara May couldn't look away, you deaf, Burrow barked, one hand twitching near the pistol on his hip. The man stepped forward once, slow, as if to say, I don't need to run, and you're not worth chasing. He took off his wide-brimmed hat and looked straight at Ezekiel. His voice came low and level, like thunder behind a hill. They're coming with me. Ezekiel let out a dry laugh, but it caught on something sharp. You don't know who we are? I know enough. Burrow shifted his weight. His fingers brushed the pistol, but the man didn't so much as blink. He laid his rifle across both arms, calm, barrel down but ready. Ezekiel looked at the trees, then at the sky. It was late in the day, and they were miles from town. A man with nothing to lose and a gun in hand was a poor gamble. He spat again, closer this time, and turned. "You take M then. Good luck with the curse." Burra muttered something cruel, and followed. The sound of their departure was swallowed by the trees. Clara May didn't move. Liza June reached for her shawl, but her hand shook. The man turned toward them, but still said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a flask. He held it out not like a favor, but like an offering. Clara May took it. The water was warm, but it hit her chest like grace. Then he motioned toward a narrow trail behind him. "My wagon's a ways back. You're not safe here." They followed without question. The forest softened as they walked. Birdsong returned. The light turned gold. Somewhere far off, an owl called too early. Clara May felt the weight in her bones change no lighter, not yet, but rearranged, like the sorrow was shifting to somewhere it could be held. They reached the wagon, old but solid, painted in faded green. The mule turned its head lazily. The man helped Liza June up without a word. When he offered Clara May his hand, she hesitated. He didn't press, just waited, still as stone. She took it. His palm was rough and dry. It felt real. The ride was quiet. Wind whistled through the boards, and the scent of wood smoke clung to the man's coat. Clara May watched the way he handled the reins, confident, without flourish, like someone who knew what it meant to guide without force. As the sky burned into orange, the first glimpse of his land came into view. A wide field fenced in raw timber, a red barn leaning slightly west, and a house small but square against. The ridge cattle grazed in the distance. A dog barked once and then quieted. He pulled the wagon to a stop near a bunkhouse behind the barn. Dismounting, he looked up at them, eyes gentler now but still unreadable. "You can stay here," he said finally, "as long as you need." He didn't ask questions, didn't offer his name, just walked toward the house, slow and steady, like he knew not to startle something skittish. Clara May watched his back, the way he moved, like a man used to carrying silence. Liza June leaned against the wagon's side and exhaled a long breath she'd been holding since spring. Inside the bunkhouse, there were 2 cots, a stove, and a wooden table. It smelled of cedar and ash. A folded quilt lay at the foot of one bed. The window looked east, toward the slope of the ridge. As night pressed down, Liza June lay still, eyes closed. But Clara May stood at the window, one hand against the glass. The sky was full of stars, more than she'd seen in years. She didn't know the man's name, or why he'd stepped in when no one else had, but she knew the feeling in her chest was changing. Not soft yet, not healed, but steady. She pressed her fingers to the sill, stared out at the darkness, and whispered into the hush of the bunkhouse, "I'm not ready to thank you, but I won't forget." Outside, across the field, a lamp flickered in the ranch. House. And though no one saw it, the quietest smile touched the mouth of the man inside. Mornings on the ranch began in hush and frost. Mist unspooled from the pasture like breath from a sleeping giant, and dew clung to every blade of grass like a second chance. Clara May stood outside the bunkhouse, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching the mule twitch its ears at nothing. Behind her, Liza June stirred a pot of cornmeal mush in silence, the spoons scraping soft circles like the turning of a slow clock. The rancher had not asked them to stay, nor had he asked them to leave. He simply went about his work each day with the quiet persistence of a man who trusted more in effort than in speech. They learned his name from a carved post on the barn, Boone Ranch, and from the dog that answered, only to Boone, barking at dusk as if to say, "This place is watched. This place is mine." Silas Boone said little, but his presence was constant. He rode out at dawn, returned before dark, and left small offerings they didn't see him deliver. Chopped firewood stacked neat beside the door, a coil of rope hung for ease, a basket of eggs left on the step. No note, no acknowledgement. The town, however, spoke plenty. It started with a ride into Dustmere. Liza June had insisted they replace the worn soles of their boots and find cloth to sew some dignity back into their appearances. Clara May hesitated, but agreed. They rode the mule into town with borrowed coin and Boone's quiet nod. The moment their feet touched the general store's wooden porch, eyes followed. A group of women stood outside the mercantile, bonnets sharp and mouths sharper. One whispered, another gasped. The oldest among them, Miss Holder from the church board, narrowed her gaze. "Can't say I ever saw grief make a woman walk straighter," she muttered, loud enough to land like a slap. Inside the store, the judgment thickened. Mr. Keating, the storekeeper, paused before handing over the fabric Clara May chose. "You sure you can pay for that?" he asked, gaze drifting to her plain dress. She placed the coins on the counter with deliberate calm. "We don't take what isn't ours." He didn't answer, but he wrapped the cloth with jerky hands. Back at the ranch, Clara May folded the fabric in silence, her fingers tracing the embroidery patterns her mother once taught her. Liza June boiled a kettle hard enough to shake the stove. "They think we've seduced him," Liza finally snapped. "The whole damn town. Just for not dying like they wanted." Clara May didn't answer. She didn't know how to say that she felt their judgment like thorns under her skin, but felt something else, too. A strange tenderness growing where fear used to sit. A feeling she wasn't ready to name. That night, Boone returned late. He'd been to town too, no doubt heard the same whispers. His jaw was tight, knuckles red from fence work. At supper, he said little, as usual. But when Clara May placed a jar of pickled beans on the table, her doing, from the cellar he nodded once. A small thing, but it stayed with her longer than a compliment might have. The days turned dry. Summer settled its weight on the land. Boone taught Liza June how to set snares without speaking, just demonstrating with calloused hands and a twine string. Clara May noticed he always left the well bucket full when he'd been there last. He watched her, sometimes, when he thought she didn't see. One evening, she caught him doing just that. He was oiling a hinge on the barn door, glancing toward the bunkhouse window where she stood, light behind her. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Then came the chicken. It was left on the bunkhouse stoop one morning. Neck twisted, feathers half plucked, blood smeared like a warning. No note, no signature, but the message was clear. They were being watched, resented, hated for daring to survive. Clara May buried it herself, hands steady, mouth a tight line. Boone came by that afternoon, saw the disturbed dirt, and said nothing, but that night he sharpened his rifle on the porch. The next day, Boone handed her a knife. Not large, not loud, just something sharp enough to matter. She didn't ask what to do with it. She wore it tucked inside her boot from then on. Then, near sundown 2 days later, the Caldwell brothers returned. They didn't ride in proud like before, no, this time they came in on foot, staggering from town drunk, the sun setting behind them like a warning flare. Clara May saw them first from the well, her bucket half raised, rope dripping. She froze. Boone was already moving. he stepped. Between them and the bunkhouse with the same slow certainty he'd shown in the woods. His rifle wasn't raised, but it was there leaning casually against his leg, as if daring them to make it necessary. "You've had your say," Boone said, voice low and flat. "We want what's ours." Ezekiel slurred. "You keep in. Women who belong to our family, they're not things," Boone said. "And they don't belong to you." Burrow stepped forward, hand twitching. "They took from us food, a bed." "That land, you threw them out," Boone interrupted. "The land stayed." "They didn't." Liza June stepped onto the porch. Clara May joined her, boots firm on the boards. No trembling now. Burrow spat into the dirt. "We'll be back. With the sheriff, he'll see it straight." Boone's smile was grim, cold. "Then bring him." They turned and left, muttering curses swallowed by the dust. The sky above boiled orange and crimson, like the earth itself was angry. That night, Boone didn't sleep in his house. He brought his bedroll outside and sat under the stars with his rifle across his knees. Eyes open, a lone guardian against the weight of a cruel world. Clara May watched from the bunkhouse window. Then, without telling Liza June, she stepped into the night barefoot, walked to where he sat, and sat beside him. He didn't speak, neither did she. They watched the stars until her shoulder brushed his. When she whispered, it wasn't with weakness. "They'll keep coming." Boone nodded once. "So will I," she didn't cry. But something in her softened. The silence between them stretched long and deep like the river below the ridgeful of things unspoken. Powerful in their stillness, from that night on, Boone brought 2 coffee cups to the fence post where he watched the dawn. One for himself, one left beside him, steam curling into the morning. Clara May didn't always take it. But some mornings, she did. Then came the letter, tacked to the barn door with a Niffer real sheriff's notice, stating a summons had been issued. Charges, trespassing, accusations, theft, impropriety, occupation of Caldwell land. Signatures: Ezekiel Caldwell and Burrow Caldwell. The trial was to be held in Dustmere 3 days hence. Boone read it without flinching. Clara May stood behind him, reading each word like it was a brand against her skin. Liza June paled. "They'll twist everything," Liza said. "They'll say we seduced you, took your kindness and warped it." Clara May looked at Boone. "You don't have to do this." "I know," he said. He turned, met her gaze, and something passed between them, something older than either of their wounds. 3 days later, Boone rode into town with the 2 women seated behind him. The townsfolk gathered on porches and leaned out of windows, eyes wide. Some whispered, some smirked, but most simply watched, not yet sure what story they were seeing unfold. Inside the small courthouse, the Caldwell brothers sat smug and upright. But when Boone entered, hat in hand, Clara May at his side, Liza behind them like a quiet storm, the room felt a hush. "I'll speak first," Boone said. And speak he did, not in loud words, not in fancy language. Just truth, plain and clean as spring water. He spoke of abandonment, of violence masked as duty, of women left to rot and the decency it took to stand them back up. He didn't defend their honor, he described it by the end. Even the judge didn't meet his eye. The charges were dismissed. Outside, the town still whispered, but Clara May didn't hear them. She only heard Boone, later that night, asking quietly, "Do you feel safe here yet?" She looked at him, not as a savior, not as a man who rescued her, but as someone who stood with her. "I don't know," she said, "but I feel seen." And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Boone brought 3 coffee cups to the fence post, and when he looked to his left, she was already there, waiting.